All right, let's talk about the last of the 10 commandments, because it's a real head-scratcher. It's the one commandment that almost all of us break, but honestly, very few people ever seem to lose any sleep over it.
I mean, seriously, think about it. If you ask a room full of people, hey, have you ever coveted something? Just about every hand is going to shoot up, probably with a little laugh. But if you asked about, say, adultery or murder, yeah, you get dead silence. So the challenge isn't getting people to admit they covet. The real problem is getting anyone to actually care. So, why is that?
Well, to understand why we treat it so lightly, you first have to realize just how weird this commandment is. I mean, it is completely unlike any other law from the ancient world. What makes it so unique is that it's not about doing something wrong, it's about thinking something wrong. It's a thought crime. You can scour the Code of Hammurabi or any other ancient legal text, you won't find a law against a desire. And of course, because you can't prove what someone is thinking in a court of law, there's no penalty for it listed anywhere in the Bible. This law is completely on us to enforce, inside our own heads.
Okay, so if it's just a thought, maybe it's not that big a deal, right? Well, this is where a little bit gets lost in translation. The original Hebrew word reveals a much deeper and, frankly, more active meaning.
So the Hebrew word here is hamad, and it doesn't just mean a passing wish, like, oh, I wish I had a car like that. No, hamad means to desire something with the active intention of taking it. It's a desire that's already planning its next move. So the crucial point here is this isn't about some harmless fantasy, it's about a budding conspiracy.
The prophet Micah just lays it out perfectly, connecting the thought directly to the action. They covet, and then they seize. They desire, and then they take. You see? The thought isn't the end of the story. It's the engine just starting to turn over.
So, if coveting is the engine, where exactly does it drive us? Well, there is no better or more tragic example of this in all of ancient literature than the story of King David and Bathsheba.
This verse from the New Testament frames it perfectly. Covetousness isn't the final act, it's the conception. It's the seed that, if you don't do anything about it, grows into sin and ultimately into something far, far darker. And David's story is just a horrifying case study of this exact progression. It all starts with that thought crime. He covets Bathsheba. That desire then gives birth to the sin of adultery. When that creates a new problem, a pregnancy, the sin grows bigger, into deceit, as he desperately tries to cover it all up. And when that fails, it becomes fully grown, giving birth to death, the brutal murder of an innocent, loyal soldier. One harmless desire spiraled into a total catastrophe.
Now, that's a pretty extreme story from thousands of years ago. But what does this look like today? I mean, we may not turn into murderers, but what happens when an entire culture is basically built on fulfilling these very desires?
For most of us in the developed world, we don't have to go down David's path. If we covet our neighbor's brand new phone or their fancy car, we don't have to plot and steal it. Our affluence and easy access to credit mean we can just go out and buy our own, maybe an even better one. In a way, we haven't gotten rid of the desire, we've just sanitized it. We've turned a moral problem into a simple financial transaction.
In fact, our culture actively encourages this. The source material points to this incredible moment in recent history. After a devastating national tragedy, the prescribed patriotic act was to go shopping. It just shows how deeply this idea is embedded in our society. Our economy isn't just supported by our constant desires, it actively requires them. The whole system runs on a steady, simmering state of covetousness.
And the data really puts this into a stunning perspective. The US has just over 4% of the world's population. But, and this is wild, it consumes over 30% of the world's goods. I mean, call it ambition, call it gluttony, whatever you call it, the result is a culture of an immense and, it seems, an absolutely insatiable appetite.
But here is the devastating irony. Does getting everything we want actually make us happy? The evidence says a hard no. In fact, it suggests the complete opposite. Affluent teens, the very ones who can have their desires met most easily, report the highest rates of mental health struggles. This constant cycle of wanting and getting, the sanitized, socially approved coveting, it isn't fulfilling. For so many, it leads to a quiet kind of despair.
So if coveting, even when we get what we want, leads to such a dark place, what's the way out? Well, the text proposes a pretty powerful and actually very simple antidote.
First, we have to recognize the poison for what it is. See, unchecked coveting usually starts as simple envy. But that envy can sour into resentment, where we start thinking, why them and not me? They don't even deserve it. And that resentment, if it's left to fester, can curdle into outright hatred,
which poisons our relationships and, of course, our own hearts.
The antidote is to completely shift your focus. Covetousness is all about a restless dissatisfaction, always looking outward at what you lack. Its polar opposite is thankfulness, a state of contentment, focused inward on appreciating what you already have. It's really the difference between being a hungry ghost and being a person at peace.
And that leaves us with this final thought. We saw with King David how coveting became the gateway to adultery, deceit, and murder. It leads down a path of destruction. So the question to leave you with is this. If that's where coveting leads, what is thankfulness the gateway to? What kind of world does that path open up?